Hi, I'm Laurie McLeod, and I am Associate Professor of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Pacific Lutheran University. Thank you so much for watching my talk, Economic Inequality in the 2020 Election. In the talk today, I'm going to talk about the state of economic inequality in the United States in 2020, and I'm going to discuss why I think it is a major issue in the election, even though a lot of voters are not suggesting that it is a major issue for them. And then I'm going to talk briefly about kind of how it affects the election and what we might expect from the results of the election, given the importance of economic inequality in the United States. So in terms of thinking about economic inequality in the United States, I think it's important to note that our definition of being an American really is centrally hinged upon economic conditions and economic ideas. So when we think about the United States, most of the things that we really appreciate about the country or that make us feel patriotic are the abilities that we have to succeed economically, and thinking about economic mobility of our children. When we have the American dream or the concept of the American dream, that is largely tied to our economic standing. And so for all those reasons, it suggests that how we stand economically is central to how we view ourselves as Americans. And probably more importantly from a sociological perspective, is that our experiences are shaped by our economic realities. Our economic condition decides what neighborhoods we live in, the types of schools we go to, the type of work that we do, who we friend, who we marry, and all of those kinds of things are like very highly class stratified. And so our experience as Americans is very strongly defined by the economic situation that we live in. And economic inequality is so pronounced currently in the United States that it really defines our experience. Because if you think about it, there is massive inequality in the United States. And it's really hard for us, particularly those of us that have lived in stable class positions for a while, to think about or imagine what life would be like in a different economic position. Myself, I can't imagine what it would be like to have massive wealth or to experience homelessness because I have been class comfortable for quite some time in the upper middle class. And so thinking about that really shapes how I live. Also, in terms of all of the other experiences that are important in the United States, like our gender, our sexuality, our race, our ethnicity, our religion, our ability group, all of those things are amplified by their intersection with our social class. And so it really shapes how we experience the world. So what does economic inequality look like in the United States? One key thing to keep in mind is that the minimum wage as we experience it has been stagnant for quite some time. The chart that I'm presenting now from the Economic Policy Institute shows constant 2014 dollars, but shows that the overall, the amount of minimum wage, despite growing between the 1960s and the mid-2000s in sheer numbers, the purchasing power of it is actually lower. And the amount of the minimum wage has not been scaled to production. And so if we think about production and productivity, the overall economy of the United States has been doing quite well over a time. It has been growing so that we are making more overall money in our economy. However, that has not been transferred particularly to minimum wage workers. And I think it's also important to recognize that even though most of us viewing this video are probably workers in Washington, where we might make a minimum wage of $12 or $15 an hour, depending on what county we work in, the federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour, which really doesn't buy that much, even in much lower cost of living environments or areas. And so yes, most wage workers are earning slightly more than that, But even that is not scaled to what they are producing and the wealth that they are creating in the work that they do. So not only has the bottom been stagnant for a very long period of time in terms of the overall value of minimum wage and the spending power, we also see a very significant growth in the income share and the amount of income experienced by the very elite. So this chart in particular follows the 99%, the 99.9%, the 99.99%, and at the very top, the 99.999%. And this research by Gabrielle Zuckman and Emmanuel Says shows how much the top are earning relative to the overall income growth, and how that's been experienced by other income percentiles. So on the bottom axis of this graph, you can see that we have incomes broken up in every 5th percentile. And on average, almost everybody in the United States is seeing about 2% income growth over time. And that's very kind of significant because that matches kind of like what we expect for cost of living allowances and, kind of like overall income growth. But it's 2.5 times what we're seeing at the highest earners in terms of what they are earning. And this is very atypical for around the world. So the Economic Policy Institute tracked income, the growth, the comparative top growth, income growth. So for highest earners, so here this is looking at just the top 10% of income earners over time between 1980 and 2017. And even despite the 2009 recession, where we do see a dip in the wealth, particularly in the US and Northern Europe, the pre-tax income of the top 10% continues to grow, and in the United States is significantly higher than it is in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, or Northern Europe. So when we're thinking about economic inequality in the United States, particularly as it is defined by the top moving away from the bottom, the United States is quite unique. So yes, there are a few other countries that have more income inequality than the United States, but income inequality is extremely pronounced in the United States, and it is driven by the top moving away from everyone else rather than the bottom falling out of the distribution. So we live in a time of pronounced income inequality. Does that mean that income inequality is a central political issue? Depends on who you ask. So overall, among all adults, a majority of individuals say that there is too much economic inequality in the United States. So based on the survey data from Pew, they found in their sample that 61% of all Americans stated that it was concerning that there was too much, they agreed with the statement that there was too much income inequality in the United States. However, there was a strong partisan divide of this report, with 41% of Republicans or leaning Republican identifying individuals stating that it's a problem compared to 78% of strong Democrats or leaning Democrats. And despite a majority of people suggesting that there was too much income inequality, we did not have a majority of Americans. In fact, only 42% of those surveyed for this study suggested that reducing income inequality should be a priority for the federal government in 2019. And so these are people who have been living and experiencing in the pronounced inequality that we just discussed. However, they do not feel at the same time that that's something that the federal government needs to tackle in particular. Instead, they should focus on things like making healthcare more affordable, dealing with terrorism, reducing gun violence, and climate change. However, I'm going to make the case here in a little bit that it actually is the fact that a lot of these issues are actually class-pronounced issues, and a lot of our concerns are reflecting the economic inequality that we're currently experiencing. So in this study by Pew, it asked registered voters what was very important to them in the 2020 presidential election in terms of deciding their vote and thinking about how they're going to vote in the election. And 79% of all of the voters that were interviewed or surveyed suggested that the economy was a key issue or a top issue in the election, that it was going to be very important. And the economy is an amorphous thing. When we think about the economy and when we hear the economy being reported in the news, a lot of times it's talked about in terms of GDP, gross domestic product, or it's talked about in terms of like the Dow or the S&P, or like specific ties to stock market indices and how they're moving. But most sociologists suggest that the economy, in terms of individuals' felt reality or their lived reality, is talking much more about their ability to navigate the economy rather than how the economy on a macro scale is doing. And so yes, the economy exists as this macro level social institution that all of us participate in and that influence and constrains our lives in very important ways, but at the same time as individuals we still have to interact with that institution, and we do things like participate as a consumer, we hold jobs, we maintain household budgets, and so all of those things, many sociologists would agree, are more important or at least more central when individuals are talking about how the economy is important to them. So most individuals, when they say, I want the economy to do well, what they're actually saying is, I want the economy to do well so that my place in it is secure, or that I have a place that is recognizable in the economy. So, like if the economy does well, logic perhaps follows that means that my job is more secure, that means I'll have more money to send my kids to school or to support them in various ways, and I'll be able to maintain my lifestyle as I'm currently experiencing it. So the economy, it's reasonable from a sociological perspective to think about when people are discussing the economy as their top issue, they're talking about their space in the economy and how they interact with the economy rather than just the economy as a macroeconomic issue. And so in order to think about that and contextualize it, this data is from the MIT Living Wage Lab. And so the MIT Living Wage Lab does a lot of very important work and interesting work looking at how many people earn or what kinds of workers earn a living wage and what living wages are across various family formations and in various areas across the country. As we know, living in the upper Northwest, we know that it's incredibly more expensive to live on a coast. It's more expensive to live, in Pierce County or in King County than it is in lots of other counties in Washington. And so even if we earn a higher wage maybe than some of our family or friends on the east side of the state or in the middle of the country, we spend a lot more proportionally because of costs. So the MIT Living Wage Lab looks at lots of working class earners, minimum wage earners, living wage earners to see how they spend their money. And on average, this kind of looks at overall the amount of money and the distribution of earnings for working class and minimum wage earning workers. So here, if we're thinking about a minimum wage worker, and so again, thinking that federally this means that you're earning $7.25 an hour, we have people spending about just over a fifth of their income on housing, about a fifth of their income on childcare, about a fifth of their income on transportation, and then the remaining 2/5 on food, healthcare, and other various costs. And so, kind of then for me, thinking about it as an economic sociologist, when I see people saying that, like affordable healthcare is a priority, it is how that healthcare exists in relation to their own budget, or when they're thinking about transportation costs, or they're thinking about childcare, right? That is understood as how that exists within their own budget, right? So not necessarily thinking about it amorphously in terms of like how many trillions of dollars as a society we spend on a childcare system, but instead thinking about like in my own family budget, what does that mean? And so like, I think that this makes issues of economic inequality a lot more central because from a sociological perspective, we cannot dismiss the interconnectivity between our economic experiences and our economic realities and other social institutions, particularly in the sense that so many institutions within the context of the United States are individualized so that they are our primary responsibility in terms of paying and taking care of them, rather than it being a social safety net that is provided to all participants or all citizens of our society. So the next thing I really want to talk about is how our views on economic inequality are political. And a lot of times, the way that we define what is a problem in an economically unequal world, or how we address economic inequalities in a world, are very political in and of themselves. And so I have a few that I'd like to highlight. So the first thing that I want to highlight is an idea coming from mid-20th century sociology by a sociologist named Herbert Gans of the deserving versus the undeserving poor. And so a lot of times when we're thinking about how we're going to address economic inequality, we have a disagreement about who the population even is. So a lot of times when we're doing this and we're creating policy or we're deciding whether or not we support policy, a lot of the narrative around that goes to trying to identify one group as a clear, deserving group of aid, and another group as an undeserving group of aid. And so when when we think about things like having immigration in the United States as an example, it's not that we're deciding whether or not there should be any immigrants to the United States, right? We're not discussing whether or not we should have zero immigration or permit immigration. Instead, what we're doing and what becomes the political battle is trying to identify for each party who the deserving group is. So is a deserving group of immigration a group that experiences genocide in their home country? Is it anyone who's willing to move? Is it people who have specialized training? And so all of these debates hinge on this drawing of deserving versus undeserving poor. Even when we're thinking about things like housing or food assistance or childcare assistance, a lot of this is determined by how we make draw that line between deserving and undeserving individuals. And so that's why in the United States, a lot of our inequality policies, economic inequality policies, target groups like the elderly or children or families with children, because those tend to be the groups that we are more permissible in seeing as deserving, and that those groups exist across party lines, rather than, say, college students, which I assume is a large target or a large audience of this talk. A lot of college students are very low earning individuals or overall low income individuals. But as a society, we don't think about that those are the people that are most in need of poverty aid, right? So how do we get broke college students, money and food and housing? Instead, we think that those are people that are just making choices, right? So you make the choice to go to college instead of going to full-time work. And so by virtue of making that choice as we perceive it, that puts you as undeserving of aid. So our views on economic inequality are also oftentimes very much shaded by our central values. So when we're thinking about justice philosophy, a philosopher by the name of John Rawls puts forth the idea that in the United States we have two very strong, very central values. So we value liberty, or the ability for everyone to do whatever they want and have freedom over their actions. And we value equality. So we want every single person's voice heard. We want people to have opportunity to get to the same outcome. And so those two values are very, very important. However, they conflict with one another. So you can't have equality in a society that has perfect liberty, and you can't have liberty in a society that has perfect equality. Instead, you have to make a trade-off. So, to kind of put some example on this, if I am able to do whatever I want, then I don't have to value what someone else does or what someone else has, right? Because if it is my liberty to do whatever I want, then I can take your iPhone and I can live in your house and I can drive, all the cars. I can have all the cars, because that's my choice to do so. Be it coercive or legitimate or however I get there. That said, if I live in a fully equal society, then I can't have liberty to go do my own thing, right? Because if my thing is to, produce inequality, then I can do that, right? Or if my thing is to prioritize one person's voice over another, in terms of thinking about it from a democratic example, I can't do that. And so the central values are incompatible with one another. And these central values both influence how we view inequality and inequality distribution, and economic distribution, but they also underwrite both major political parties, where the Republican Party or conservatives are much stronger proponents of liberty generally, and Democrats or progressive individuals, liberal individuals, are much stronger proponents of equality. And by virtue of the goals of those values, or the actualization of those values being incompatible with one another, that also makes the central ideologies of conservatives and progressives to be incompatible with one another. So another thing to think about, or that I'd like to highlight, is that there is a partisan difference between how we view the solutions to inequality, which both tie into our views about who is deserving and undeserving, and in terms of whether or not we value liberty or equality. So if we are thinking about addressing widespread inequality, so for instance, if we know in the United States we have individuals with negative net worth, we have unhomed individuals, we have very, very poor individuals, and then we have billionaires. That's a lot of distance between the two, right? And, we can have lots of different philosophies for how to compact those distances or make there be smaller overall inequality between the groups. And so for some individuals, the solution is going to be individual. And so that means that we're going to invest in individuals, we're going to prioritize individual decisions, so why is this person going to college or going to trade school instead of the other, and vice versa, right? But we're going to think that the solution is for individuals to take action to close the gap. So it is up to people to do it rather than structural solutions. And so structural solutions might be that we change our job structure, or we change taxation, or we change the wage structure, right? And those kinds of things are going to be more mandated by policy and governmental decision and the way that organizations are ran, rather than left up to individuals. What we see is that, and again, I'm back to Pew data here, but when we're polling, Republicans are much more likely than Democrats to suggest that individual causes create inequality, and Democrats are much more likely to suggest that structural causes create inequality, which also suggests then that Republicans will favor individual solutions and Democrats will favor structural solutions. And so, again, when we're thinking about what this means for our political system, as we're making changes, groups have different priorities, and they're going to target different things, and we will not necessarily have a unified attempt at addressing the inequality, right? So for instance, if you see something that is extremely polarized, like the discrimination against racial and ethnic minorities, with Republicans thinking that only 11% of Republicans thinking that leads to income or economic inequality, and 50% of all Democrats suggesting that leads to economic inequality. You're going to have way more Democratic policy and way more Democratic voters or Democratic-leaning individuals motivated to do something about systemic racial inequality. For Republicans, they may not just think it's an issue, right? Or they may think that it's something that an individual should address rather than the structure itself. Even beyond this, in terms of thinking about achieving the American dream, is very partisan. And so when you're looking at, so this slide has information for both 2019 and 2009 from Gallup polls, and asked individuals that, if you work hard, which is a very amorphous thing, right? But if you work hard and play by the rules, do you think you'll be able to meet the American dream? And so not only is there a partisan divide where Republicans feel much more likely that individually they can accomplish the American dream than can Democrats. You also see Republicans between 2009 and 2019 becoming increasingly likely to agree with this, while Democrats are becoming increasingly likely to disagree with this. So again, a partisan gap is growing. It already existed in terms of Republicans thinking that this is something that we have more individual control over, and so therefore are more likely to agree, while Democrats less so, but now even more so, Democrats are less likely to, that's growing. Like less Democrats are thinking that that's something that is individually achievable. And overall, 38% of Democrats suggest that the American dream is unattainable, while only 11% of Republicans suggest that. And the trends go in the opposite direction, with a decreasing number of Republicans seeing the American dream as unattainable, with an increasing percentage of Democrats perceiving that the American dream is unattainable. I also think, and perhaps this is the stats professor in me, but I also can't help but think about the role of prioritizing what in the stats world we would think of as type 1 and type 2 errors over as part of the partisan divide in how we address income and economic inequality. So if we are going to fail at addressing income inequality, we can fail in one of two ways. We can either overhelp, so we can have people who may not need help, but we perceive them to need help, so we give aid, or we can fail to help. So we can have people who need help, but because that doesn't sound our alarm to recognize that they need help, we fail to get them the help that they need. And again, this is a very partisan issue. As a whole, as a society, we prioritize failing to help over helping. So in terms, and perhaps it's individualism, perhaps it's liberty, there's a lot of sociological theoretical ideas as to why this is, but in general, we tend to, we would rather fail to help someone in need rather than give aid to someone who doesn't need it on accident. And, certainly with the COVID stimulus, there was a big discussion about this, right? Like, why should every house why should every worker get this money, right? Like, what about the people who are rich? Why would we do that, even if it means that it expedites the aid? For those of you, again, assuming that a lot of you are college students in my audience, like the whole FAFSA is set up to presume that your parents and your family are able to contribute as much as possible, or that you will turn to loans rather than over giving aid, perhaps to families who don't need it. And so, that narrative also will grow income inequality, because a lot of times then, there's kind of two ways to create equality. We can either bring the bottom down or bring the top up. And if we're failing to recognize people on the bottom or lift them up because our bar for what the bottom is kind of maybe lower than it needs to be, then we don't aid from that way either. The final thing I want to talk about in terms of thinking about how sociologists view that economic inequality affects our political views in the election is what sociologist Arlie Hochschild talks about in her book, Strangers in Their Own Land. She calls these deep stories, or the feelings that individuals have that they believe to be true, regardless of whether or not they're true. Because from a sociological perspective, how we perceive reality is what we act on. So it doesn't matter what reality actually is. It's what we define reality to be that actually becomes reality. And so once we have these definitions of reality, then we act on them, right? And both in both of these books, so I'm not going to be able to account how wonderful both of these books are, and so I'll just suggest that you put both of them on your reading list. They're both fantastic. But Arlie Hochschild talks about how individuals in the Tea Party, and particularly looking at low-earning Republicans in Louisiana, that they felt as if they were being overlooked by the government because they had kind of been waiting patiently and playing by the rules, yet when it came out to kind of divvy up the resources and help people achieve the American dream, that the government was like kind of going around and pulling up other people rather than helping them, despite the fact that they had been in line. Jennifer Silva finds something similar in We're Still Here. She looks primarily at individuals, working class, young adults in Pennsylvania. And they also talk about how they feel like their struggles have just been overlooked by the government, that they don't feel like that there's any opportunity for structural help. And so it's just up to them, right? So if they're going to do anything about their economic circumstances, that they're going to do it alone, and that it's going to be an individual project. And so in both of these cases, you have working class individuals who probably could use or have in fact benefited from government aid, suggesting that we shouldn't use it, or that as a society we shouldn't have aid policies or divvy it out, because it doesn't work, right? It either doesn't work or it doesn't get to the people who need it. And so again, kind of in fear of these kind of over helping, they'd rather reject it and just go it alone instead. And so both of these kind of lend themselves in the news. Another example of deep stories is how much we hear about like economic insecurity, and how economic insecurity led to modern militia groups or the modern right or QAnon or whatever, right? All kinds of groups get economic inequality attributed to why they exist. But that's a deep stories understanding from a sociological perspective. So I just wanted to bring it up. And I would also be remiss to suggest that economic inequality doesn't play a huge role in local politics. So if you think about local politics, so this picture here is of a homeless encampment underneath I-5 around the SeaTac area. And, if you listen to the local politics, either of the Washington governor's race or lieutenant governor's race, or if you listen to local races that are happening in Pierce County or King County, so much of it has to do with, how individuals experience economic inequality. So we talk about homelessness, and we talk about it both in terms of how unhomed individuals experience their lives, but also how homelessness affects individuals who are homed, but are living and working in areas. We hear about jobs and job creation. We hear about wages, right? So again, it's this idea of like our economic reality being influential of our political ideas. And, one of the things that we've learned from COVID, and I'll just talk about this very briefly, is that COVID exacerbates economic inequalities as they currently exist. And so every single inequality that it already has existed is just getting pronounced by COVID. So when we're thinking about this, like being able to do our work from home is a very classed reality. A lot of working class individuals and minimum wage workers work in things that we consider to be necessary or, required services. So, you have to have Target open, you have to have grocery stores open, or at least that's how we've defined our COVID reality. We have to have, especially if we're going to let the affluent shelter in place largely, we have to have the working class delivery drivers or gig workers bringing them their groceries and their food and their Amazon orders, right? Whereas, our programmers, our lawyers, our professors, our engineers, they are much more likely to be able to do their work remotely. Similarly, when you look at who is losing their jobs, most low earners or working class earners are more likely to lose their jobs during the pandemic. And this looks only at a short period of time. This is data from The Economist, or published in The Economist, I should say. But you see that, despite all income percentiles losing jobs, the overwhelming amount of jobs that are lost are going to be of working class minimum wage workers. That is not because wealth isn't being made. So this study by the Institute for Policy Studies found that billionaires during this period of March 18th to June 17th, this growth over 3 months, billionaires on average in the United States saw their overall wealth growing 20%. And so if you remember, as I said earlier, when we're thinking about inequality and economic inequality, we can either bring the bottom up or we can bring the top down to try to achieve parity. But during COVID, what we've seen is that the existing gaps are just growing. So the rich are growing further away, and the working class are dipping further down or falling further down. So how then does the 2020 election influence inequality policies? It all depends, right? This stuff is highly partisan, as I've already suggested, and we can expect that what economic inequality will look like in 4 years is largely dependent on who is making the policy decisions. So you have something like a wealth tax. So this data shows, this is from Data for Progress, and it looks at voters in so-called swing states and what they think about wealth taxes. And at the time of survey, we see that wealth taxes are pretty popular. They're pretty popular for everybody, but particularly popular when we're looking at Democrats, leaning Democrats, and independent voters. And so we might expect that if we have a Biden-Harris victory, if the Democrats are able to flip the Senate, that something like a wealth tax would be a reasonable policy pursuit of theirs, and that would be something that could address economic inequality. Similarly, and I will say, please go to Gabriel Zuckman's Twitter. He's a great follow in general, but he has an animated version of this graph that tells a much better picture than what I can do with a still. However, what this graph does and what his research with Emmanuel says looks at is the total tax rate and how it's changed from 1950 to 2019. And in 1950, the top earners were paying around 70% of their total income per year in taxes. And that's fluctuated over time, but it went from around 70% in 1950 to around 22% roughly in 2018. So the amount of money that we're taking from the top individuals is much smaller. We are taxing lower earners more. So when you're looking at the 0 to the 10th decile of earners, they're paying significantly more, a significantly larger percentage of taxes, from about 15% to about 25% between 1950 to 2018. However, even though that's more individuals than, say, the top 0.001%, the overall amount of money that they're paying is way less, because the top 1% own about 48% roughly of all income made in the United States, while the bottom 20% have like a single digit percentage, right? So the overall percentage is so much larger, and the overall income and wealth concentrated in the top is so much larger that if we saw a higher total tax rate on those individuals, we would see a lot more money coming in tax revenue. And so again, this is something that the Trump-Pence campaign has said extensively that they are not interested in raising taxes, and perhaps would look to lower taxes, on the wealthy, but on everyone, while the Biden-Harris campaign suggests, and lots of Democrats suggest, that they would be interested in raising tax, and particularly raising tax on high earners. Another political issue that is likely to be influenced by the election is the likelihood of a federal minimum wage increase. So again, I think sometimes as someone who lives in Washington, I lose sight of federal minimum wage from time to time, because that's not, our minimum wage is higher in Pierce County and in King County. However, and in the state of Washington as a whole. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that the purchasing power of that is much higher. So here, kind of looking at where paychecks would stretch more, right? That, even in our state earning more, and the federal minimum wage earning more, also would suggest that Washington minimum wage would become higher. That's kind of how it's worked in the past. That would raise that would still raise the standard of our workers, but it would significantly raise the standard of living for workers in the Midwest, in the Atlantic South, in the Southwest, where those earners are currently making $7.25 an hour and would have much more purchasing power if they were raised, particularly to something as drastic as the $15 minimum wage. Finally, again, speaking specifically to individuals who are in college, as I imagine that is most of the audience, we do have some discussion about forgiveness and likelihood of forgiveness for student loans. And this is particularly interesting, or, an interesting policy pursuit for Democrats, although both parties have suggested different visions of what loan forgiveness might look like for college graduates or college attendees. Again, this is a partisan issue, and it is due, I argue, and I think that most sociologists would also argue, that it is because of the way that we perceive the cause of the issue, right? Or, kind of thinking about this. So for instance, here, this graph is showing us across generations who individuals believe are most at fault for the amount of student loans and the amount of student loan debts that young adults have. And it is much more likely for Democrats to suggest that it is about banks and colleges, and Republicans much more likely to think that it is about the people who take the loans, in terms of trying to explain why so many people are so heavily burdened by loans. But loan forgiveness goes a long way, particularly as we think about, so this is looking just at COVID effects, but we see a wildly increasing amount of young adults, particularly moving back at home during COVID, and this is largely attributed to wage and job loss by sociologists. And young adults, particularly young college graduates, and particularly female young college graduates, increasingly earning less money. And so even among female college graduates, we see them going into specialized service work, like social work or teaching, that is relatively low paid. And that the wages for those kinds of jobs are not increasing, and are not keeping pace with cost of living. And so the wages that these young adults face are dropping, particularly for women, and all of those can affect our ability to exist, and can also grow economic inequality. So what happens post-2020? We're really in deep in terms of thinking about economic inequality. So thinking that we're just going to end it all of a sudden, like, we're going to wake up in 2022 and everyone's going to be equal, it's unlikely. Even thinking about a vast change in distributional policy is probably going to be unlikely in terms of like something being very rapid. Also, as a sociologist, just thinking not only in terms of political polarization, but thinking about how central our politics are to our ideologies and how different our ideologies are growing from one another because they're kind of being fundamentally kind of anchored to incompatible issues. I expect that political polarization may continue. So that's reasonable. But it is also very reasonable to think, as I just argued, that economic inequality will be affected by the next administration. And perhaps where I see the most hope is that for 2020 and beyond, because Generation Z, or for those of you who are traditional age college students, you are much more politically motivated than other generations to be wanting to address economic distributional issues and climate issues in particular. And so that suggests that maybe you will have creative and perhaps effective ways of dealing with these kinds of inequalities. I'd like to acknowledge and reference and thank everyone who put together resources that helped me give this talk. And I certainly welcome you to ask me any questions that you have, or you can also put them in comments, and I'll try to watch comments on channels and come by periodically to answer them as well. Thank you so much. Please vote if you're able, and think about how important it is to participate in politics and in government if you're interested in issues of economic inequality. Thank you.